Tablature troubles, why guitar tabs aren't the universal answer, the limits of tab in a digital, modular, and AI-driven musical world, the historical context of the guitar tab, in other words, why tablature was invented. Noting, in a prior presentation, we looked at the pros and cons of the most traditional way to write down and read musical ideas, musical information, songs, melodies, and so forth. That, of course, being sheet music. Now, one of the limitations with sheet music, in particular, if we're looking at a specific instrument like a guitar, is that the sheet music is designed with the musical computer of the day in mind, that being the piano. So obviously the tablature is the most specific way to write down the musical information with the specific instrument of the guitar in mind. That said, however, it still has some limitations that looks like it's still mirroring some of the problems or some of the mental framework that was designed based on, in essence, the piano. So let's take a look at the pros and cons here. It was created as a guitar-specific shortcut. So note, when you hear the term shortcut, that's going to lead you in your mind to think, well, if I was a real musician, I would be using sheet music, but I'm not, because I'm just tinkering around and therefore I'm using tablature. Now, there is some truth to that, because if you can read the sheet music, you have more context. But we talked about the pros and cons of sheet music as well in the modern day. In other words, the sheet music isn't in essence the answer either. We would like to come up with some type of system to be able to write down the information more efficiently than the sheet music in a universal way, and then possibly create more specific tools for specific instruments like the guitar, which could be designed better than we currently have with the tablature. So in other words, don't feel bad about using tablature. Don't feel like the sheet music is somehow more sophisticated. It is in some senses, but it still has its own kind of problems. So that's just when it would be appropriate to use a particular tool. It's meant to show finger placement rather than abstract notation. So when we're thinking about the tablature, we're really kind of mirroring things. We're trying to show something in the tablature, kind of like someone doing the actual information on like a YouTube, so that we can copy their fingering exactly. Now, these days, of course, we have more information like YouTube and videos that can help us with that mirroring kind of information, which might be better techniques than before we had that, in which case we had to actually write down, put your finger here, put your finger there, here's the strings, here's where you put your fingers. So become popular in folk, rock, and modern guitar teaching. So obviously this is in folk and rock, those are going to be the areas that kind of deviated from traditional music, using the guitar more as kind of the computer of the day to be writing songs and play melodies, even though it does not have as much range as the piano. Obviously, these days, if you want the most range to be able to play both hands and whatnot, you might just use a computer. A DAW system, I think, is going to replace some of the musical idea creativity that takes place usually with someone that has a piano, because they have the biggest range. But the guitar still has a pretty good range for certain types of music that you're going to be playing with. So works well for showing riffs, licks, and basic shapes. So the core problems with the tablature. Tabs are helpful but incomplete. So the upside down layout for intuitive readers. Now, I'll show this in a second, but notice that when we look at the tablature, if you have something like this on the tab, then the number is going to be representing the fret that we're on, and then we have the strings that we're going to be on. Noting, however, that the strings are kind of upside down. In other words, when I'm behind the guitar playing position, then I have the lowest heavy string on top, closest to the ceiling. The highest or thin string is on the bottom. So you would think the most intuitive way to write the tab would be similar, as though we imprinted the guitar on the page. But for some reason, they put the skinny string on top. That means that we have to kind of rearrange it in our mind, flip it around in our mind. Two reasons that might have happened. One, they might have said, well, look, if I look at the guitar and I turn it around to face the guitar, then it has the skinny string on top, or they might be thinking, well, I still like the idea of pitch rising up as it is in sheet music, and therefore that we have the skinny string on top. But it's really not the optimal way to do it if I'm practicing simply mirroring, which is what the tablature is doing. It's simply supposed to be a mirror showing you exactly where you put your fingers. So you might as well, if that's what we're doing, we should write it in as easy a way as possible. That's the point of the tablature, to be as easy as possible. If I'm just trying to mimic something, I want it to be mirrored because that's going to be the easiest way to see it. So hyper specialized for guitar, not transferable. So clearly when you look at the tablature, it only applies to the guitar, whereas a sheet music, in theory, could be read by any musician if they understand how to read, in essence, the sheet music. So it's just a tool specifically for one instrument. Chords are vague and limited. In other words, you still have the chord kind of problem where the strings are forcing us to kind of stack the chords in a way. If you play a triad, has 3 chords, but it's even kind of weirder than stacking because the strings are not evenly spaced all the way through. There's a kink in the tuning and so forth. So you still have this weird visualization of the chords, meaning you have to kind of know the shape, and you need to know the shape kind of upside down because it doesn't really mirror what you would be doing with your fingers because you would have the heavy string on top. So you have to be able to really kind of twist the thing around in your mind, have good spatial reasoning. If you played a lot of video games, you might be quite good at that, but you have to turn things around. Inversion, dropping notes, complex voicings are hard to show. So in other words, it's hard to show, you know, the chords that are playing, or an inverted chord, which is the lowest note, and so on. Still uses absolute fret numbers, not relative position. So when we're mapping this thing out, we're just saying you're putting your finger here on this string on this fret. So by doing that, then we're locking into a particular note on the guitar in essence. It's not really telling you the note, but you're still on a specific location. Whereas it would be nice if you could show relative position like Nashville number kind of system. Why? Because then you can transpose everything. In other words, if you look at something in sheet music and you're like, it's in the key of C major and I want to push it up to D major or something, you can't really do that very easily. You'd have to rewrite the whole sheet music. You can imagine in theory it should be doable in that if you had a digital sheet music that's mapping everything out in relation to one position, you should be able to move the whole thing up, right? Transpose it. That should be a tool that would be available in the modern AI era. So not built for transposition or modular rotation. So if we had Twinkle Twinkle Little Star here, then the problem is that we have the high string on top. So remember, if I'm behind the guitar, I have the skinny string is at the floor, not on the top. The low or heavy string, when I'm behind the guitar closest to the ceiling, is on top. So when I'm playing this, it's kind of like it's inverted, and I have to shift it around in my mind. You get used to that, you can kind of do it. The 3 here is representing the fret. So considering that is the fret, it's a specific location. So if I wanted to shift this entire thing up to a different key, I could kind of see it because I could just say, well, everything would shift up one key or something like that. But it would be kind of nice if we had the ability to automatically shift that information. Notice if I had a chord here, this is a melody. If it was a chord, then you're going to have multiple notes in one row, which is kind of like a form of stacking, but it's going to be a stacking that's specific to the layout of the strings on the guitar. So this is a very simple melody, which is what the tablature kind of works best with, which is basically a kind of a melody rather than complex chord structures. So upside down, so the upside down problem. Why are the tabs written backwards? So you might think, as I often have, many people don't think this, but I mean, it seems to me, why in the world didn't they write the tablature in a mirrored format? Because if I'm trying to learn by just replicating what's there, then you think you would write it in the easiest format because that's the point of the tablature. So in tab, the high E string thin one is on the top. So the low E string thick is on the bottom line. So this is opposite to how the guitar physically sees, feels the instrument. So the heavy strings closer to your face, it's closer to the ceiling. The thin strings are further away. So intuitive, no. Traditional, yes. Historically, this came from aligning tab with standard staff notation. So notice what we did is we said, hey, look, I don't like the standard staff notation, or I'm going to try to deviate from the standard staff notation because it was clearly designed with a piano in mind, and it has these sharps and flats and whatnot, and you have to assign how many sharps and flats because that helps you lay out the positioning on the piano. That's completely useless on any other instrument, including the guitar. Let's create something specific to the guitar. And they did, except they still couldn't resist having the strings inverted because then the pitch goes up, similar to what happens on the staff, even though the pitch going up on a guitar means that you're physically going down towards the floor on the guitar. So again, that to me is, we couldn't get out of the mindset. They tried to break out of the mindset and say, I'm going to make something that's specific for the guitar, but they couldn't quite do it. And they still, the piano-based, centered-based system still messed them up. And then it got locked into place because all the tablature was written that way. It became standard. Now, these days, we don't have to deal with that standard. Why? Because all the tablature can be automatically shifted with simple AI that we already have. A chat thing could basically just flip the tablature. It's one-to-one translation. So we're not locked in the errors that we made in the past simply because we wrote them down in a book, and simply because all past music is written that way is no longer a barrier to us fixing it, because it could all be transposed automatically, easier than shifting or translating from Latin to English, for example. One-to-one translation. So here's the layout of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Here it is. It would be nice, notice, to have the words as well and have basically chords that we could be mapping out on this as well. So tabs are hyper specialized. So guitar only, nothing else. So it doesn't translate to piano, bass, drums, voice, or digital tools. So if we're working specifically with tablature, we're really working on fingering something for a particular tune. It's kind of a nice way to say, this is exactly where you put your fingers for a particular melody. But it's not going to be useful when we expand it out to something more specific, like writing more complex things in a DAW system. So notice the sheet music also isn't perfect, isn't great for today's world, writing music universal for multiple instruments like bass, drum, and so on, voice, as is a DAW system. The DAW system needs to be universal so that we can compose with whatever instrument we're using, which might just simply be the computer as the instrument of composition instead of what used to be the piano or the guitar. And then we can deviate from that to tablature that could be specific for a particular instrument so that we can practice one particular thing, like mirroring a particular melody, saying this is exactly where you put your fingers. So unlike grids, numbers, or Nashville notation, tab is locked to one instrument. So reinforces finger memorization rather than musical understanding. So one of the problems with tablature is, of course, we're just mirroring. It's just like, I see what you're doing. It would be just like if I watched someone on YouTube play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and I played exactly what they're doing. Now notice, if someone did that on a video, it would be easier if I flipped them around so it looks like they're left-handed. Why? Because that would make it look like I am playing into a mirror, which will make it easier for me to play exactly what they're playing, because I would be mirroring what they're doing. That's what the tablature should be, and that's how we should kind of think of it. The tablature is like the replacement of a video that would be mirrored as though they were left-handed, so I can just mimic exactly what they're doing. Tablature is just a sheet of paper trying to do the same thing, therefore should be formatted in the same mirrored format to make it as easy as possible. But it's not the thing that we need to really learn conceptually, because it's not telling us anything about chords. It's not telling us the melody or why it works, or the Nashville numbers, or the notes that are in the collection. It's not telling us the actual notes, and it's not telling us the relative position of the notes. So chords in tab, so you can show them, yes, but poorly. So in other words, when we're looking at the tablature, it's usually best for like the melody that we're going to be basically putting in play, meaning not chords that have 3 notes on a line at least, triads or larger chords, because you can't really see the chord structure. And we have the similar problem with the tablature there that we do in sheet music as well as the DAW system, meaning when you write a chord in some kind of stacked format, then it's hard for people that don't understand the instrument or music theory to know what exactly that chord is. In other words, even if it was in sheet music or in the DAW, you're going to see 3 dots on the same row, and then you're going to say, well, what chord is that? Is it a C major? You have to figure out what chord it is by the 3 dots, instead of saying this is a C major chord, right? So you can show chords by writing numbers stacked vertically, 1 per string, works for basic open bar chords, but fails for inversions. So that means you're going to switch which is the lowest note, drop voicing. So we got chords spread across multiple octaves. It's going to be complicated instead of having the chords packed into the space that you would think they would be in. It's for jazz voicings and so on, gets complex. So obviously if we get a more complex system like the melody, which is something that's really important, that's an important part of the song, is going to be easier for us. But when we get into the chord layout, that sometimes you might want to have like the words of the song and the chords written on top in like chord structure. Now, we would like to have, in a DAW system or something, the ability to say, this is the relative position that we're playing as well as the chords. So I should be able to say in one row, I'm either playing a singular note or a chord that represents 1 octave of information. That would be the DAW system that would allow us for more complicated systems. However, that still means that the tablature has its place, but it has its specific place, and it still could be better designed than it currently is. So is that stacking or not? Yes, but it's crude, meaning the guitar tab is different than kind of the stacking in a DAW, because it's stacking based on the string structure of the guitar, which isn't completely even or is not the same as stacking in a DAW system. In other words, a DAW system or like a sheet music is going to name the sharps and flats. So you have that system because that's gonna be different in terms of which collection of notes, which is not optimal really, because it doesn't make a lot of sense for all instruments. Whereas the DAW makes sense because it's going to have 12 notes, right? And they're equally spaced out. So then when I stack the notes, then it's going to be a universal spacing. Now, the guitar, however, has 6 strings, and they're not spaced, so we don't have 12 different strings that's going to show the stacking in that format. So it is kind of like a form of stacking, but it's not like it's going up 1 note at a time, and there's a kink in the tuning, so it's not even uniform distance between the strings all the way through. So the tab stacks chords vertically, but only by coincidence and string alignment. So no way to abstract or reuse a chord shape logically, no visualization of inversions, color, or function. So again, the stacking really doesn't give you any information about like the chord from a theory standpoint. It does from a shape standpoint. You can kind of memorize that shape is a particular, like a C major chord or something like that, but it's not showing you the distance. In other words, a DAW system like this, if I see something like this, it was a C, E, and G, and I see the distance here, I'm like, oh, okay, that's going to be a major third, and this is a 7 note away. See, I can kind of count that out. 1, 2, 3, 4 notes away, 4 note away, major third, 5, 6, 7. This is a 7 note away, perfect fifth. So the DAW still is a problem, because if I don't know that, or even if I do know that, I have to count it out and say, well, is that a C major? Let me look at the distance. What is this? A D? It's going to be a D Dorian, because I have to count that out because 1, 2, 3, because this third is like 3 away, and so on and so forth. So we would like to have a system where this whole thing could be compressed so that I can write this as simply C major or just an Ionian chord, for example, and this would be a D minor 7 or something like that, or a Dorian chord would be nice. If these were the strings of a guitar, then you're not going to have 12 strings on the guitar, right? You only got 6 strings on the guitar, and the spacing isn't one note at a time. That's why the stacking is different, even though you could have a stacking kind of situation that happens coincidentally when building a chord, depending on the shape of the chord based on the layout of the guitar. So tab uses absolute numbers, not relative, not transposable. So tabs show exact fret numbers. So on the tab, it's going to show you which string you're on, and then the number is going to represent the fret. So notice what that does not show you. It doesn't show you the note that you're on, which could be useful. Like it might see it'd be nice to know if it was a C or a D or something like that. Or even more better, in my perspective, would be to show what relative position, what Nashville number are you on, what Ionian or node are you on? Are you on the Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and so on? So if you change the key, you must rewrite every number. In other words, if you wrote everything from the perspective of the modal points, then everything is automatically transposable. But if you're writing specific locations on the guitar by fret and string, X and Y axis, then you have to rewrite everything. Now, it should be all shiftable. You should have in a modern system, in a computer, everything should be shiftable. Here's how the song is written from this perspective of C major or C Dorian or whatever it is, and then you should be able to shift it up and back through all 12 collections of 7 notes, because the guitar, unlike the piano, is totally symmetrical. But Nashville numbers 1, 3, 5 instantly transposable. So tab locks you to one position, one key, and one fingering. So in other words, if I have this layout, I should be able to say, hey, look, I would like to shift this whole thing up to the next fret. All the 3s would become the 4. The 0s would become a 1. The 2s would become a 3. Now you can kind of imagine that. It's not too difficult to do because you can kind of like move them up or back, but you're going to run out of space if I shift it up forward on the guitar, and you're going to run out of frets. So it should be going out around in a loop. So we should have a system for the tablature to put the low or heavy E string on top, and then be able to easily rotate it so that we still have the proper voicing of the tune, meaning the lowest, this is the lowest note is still the lowest note, and so on. As we rotate or shift the thing forward, that should be something that should be pretty easy to do given modern technology. So in other words, like what I'd like to be able to name things as is like this is the Ionian node, this is the Phrygian, and this is the Aeolian. So if you named by the nodes, then of course I should be able to move it forward. Now if I use the tablature, like if I wrote this in a DAW, and the DAW can see that I wrote this from the perspective of a certain collection of notes, which in this case is the A major, then it knows that that's the Ionian, that's the Phrygian, that's the Aeolian. It should then be able to create tablature with the low or heavy E string on top, showing that this is going to be the 5th fret, 4th fret, 4th fret on these strings. And then I should be able to shift it forward, right? And now this is the Ionian, because now I'm in another collection of notes, which would be A sharp. So now the A sharp is the Ionian, Phrygian, Aeolian. If this was in a DAW system, it should be able to spit out the tablature saying that now we're going to start on the 6th, and then the 5th fret, and then the 5th fret. And then it moves up here. Now the 7 is the Ionian. I'm in the collection of notes around the B major. So this is the Ionian, Phrygian, Aeolian. This pattern has moved up. Now part of the problem with this, however, is that now I'm higher up on the guitar and I only have so much space going forward, right? So when I go, so if the song is going way out here past the 12th fret, then I'm going to end up with a problem because I need to utilize the space behind it. I'm going to run out of room. So in theory, if the guitar went on forever, I can just keep pushing this up. But in practice, I got to worry about, okay, if this is supposed to be the lowest note of the song, how far up can I push it? And then I have to deal with the other strings below it in order to do a similar thing. In other words, I could take this whole pattern and move it to this string, right? So now instead of playing at the 7, 6, 6, I could say it's at the 2, 1, 1, right? And then or this one goes up to the 8. So now I'm in C major collection. The C is the Ionian, Phrygian, Aeolian, but I might want to push that back down a string back here, 3rd fret down here, Ionian, Phrygian, Aeolian. So modern software should be able to generate tablature that could accommodate the shifting and then give you the exact fingering, that you can kind of play with so that you can play in any collection of 12 notes. So no mode rotation, harmonic logic. So remember, in a modern system, it's designed so that you should be able to write your entire song and then transpose it through all 12 collections of notes, as well as possibly rotate it to every modal perspective. There's 7 modal perspectives, changing the tonics upon rotation. That's a little bit more complex to do, but you should be able to do it. So the tab equals the shapes, not theory. So you can copy licks, but you can't rotate scales through modes very easily. No way to label functions like Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian. So in other words, it's labeling just the numbers are representing just where you put your finger from an XY axis, meaning the number represents the frets, the X axis. So that means you can't really change it because you don't really know what the relative positions from a Nashville number system is. You can kind of move the shape up, but it would be nice if we can know the relative positions like Ionian, Dorian, or from a Nashville number system 1 through 7 so that we can easily transpose and rotate. Doesn't teach relationship, just static grids of numbers. Great for mimicry, weak for understanding. So the basic takeaway is, of course, the tab is a tool to just mimic the fingering. It's just mimicry. You're not learning anything really other than that. You're not learning like the note names. You're not learning the relative position, the scales, relative position. You're just mimicking the tune, and then you want to build. So that could have its purpose, but it's a limited purpose. So problems, upside down layout, just as a recap. So counterintuitive for most learners, meaning we should have the lower heavy E string on top. People will argue against that, but that's the way we've done it for 300 years. Yeah, we don't need to do it anymore because some idiot wrote it down. They weren't an idiot, okay? But they wrote it down that way because they had the guitar tab stuck in their head because they can't get out of piano-centric thinking. And so that's what and then they wrote, we can change it now because we can change it. We have the ability. So we're not stuck in molasses anymore. We're not stuck in the molasses. Remember what happens, this happens with language too. Language used to change all the time. Then we wrote it down. The King James Bible is the King James Bible. If you don't talk like the king, right? And there's nothing wrong with it, with that way it was written down, but there might be better ways to say things, right? I mean, it might be the language would have changed if it hadn't been written down in a particular way, right? Similarly here, clearly in this case, we're not doing it in the optimal way, but it's been set in stone. It's been set in molasses, the fossils are in the ground, but now it's becoming unfossilized, right? Because now it's becoming fluid again. We're going from a written society back to a verbal society because now text is not king anymore. Because now we have AI, we're going back to a vocal system, which means change is now on the table. Some things need to change. Guitar only, not transferable across instruments. That's the problem, but it has its purposes. Chord notation, messy, vague, can't show complex voicing. So as a tool of mimicry, it's best basically for melodies. Stacking, crude, not modular or logic. So again, stacking of chords gets kind of ugly on Tablature. Absolute numbers, no instant transposition, so that's a problem. So that means that the tab's not going to be a solution for everything. Again, it's a mimicry for a specific thing. No modes, you can't rotate, show harmonic relationships. So the final takeaway, tabs teach fingers, not music. So again, that could have its purpose. There's nothing wrong with that, but that has a limited, obviously very limited purpose. So grid-based octave, so what we need are grid-based octave rows. So in other words, from a DAW perspective, we can have more information with the octaves. We can also compact that information to show everything in one row for one 12-octave situation. Relative Nashville numbers. So we would like to have a DAW system that can then be the master system that allows us 2 tabs or 2 dials, that being the relative number system, so I can transpose as well as rotate through the modal perspectives. Color code, shape, scale maps would be nice. Mode rotation tools. We should be able to rotate through the modes, changing the tonic as we do. Universal instrument agnostic system. So in other words, the guitar tab has its purpose for the guitar, but the DAW system now needs to be based so it's universal for all instruments should be playing it. And I believe that the new instrument, which is going to be replacing what many people use the piano for as well as the guitar for, which is the thing that you use to compose, the thing that you use to play along as you're thinking through. You could still do that, but many people might just simply be using the computer. The data input on the computer should have the capacity to tinker in a more efficient way even than the piano if we had the proper keyboard to data input into the system, which I don't think would be a piano, because the piano introduces a lot of music theory issues that people that didn't learn the piano don't need to learn that way, right? They should learn in the optimal way to do whatever they want to do.